So getting a growth rate assumption is really tough. We talked earlier that for your long-term growth rate, something tied to the U.S. economy, something in the 4 to 6% range makes a lot of sense. So what about that short-term growth rate? And the way I think about it, you first start with the industry. How fast is this industry growing? Where is it in its product life cycle? What's the demographics? If it's mainly a product bought by 20-year-olds, what's the demographics of 20-year-olds? If it's mainly bought by 60-year-olds, what's that demographic? What's going on with globalization, innovation? Just look at that. Porter's 5 forces, I don't know if you've had that yet. Extremely important concept. Hopefully you have a class where you study that. If not, you need to learn it on your own because it's very heavily used out there. So Porter's 5 forces, buyer power, rivalry within the industry, supplier power, barrier to entry, substitution threats. Michael Porter, he's still around and doing some amazing research still, but what he's doing here is he's trying to say what industries are strong industries that are growing, which ones are weak. A strong industry, buyers don't have too much power that they can dictate what this industry does for them. It's best if there's a lot of small buyers versus 2 or 3 major buyers. You don't want an industry, there's a lot of rivalry and a lot of competition within the industry. You like an industry where every company has its own unique brand identity and there's still room for growth and people aren't kind of trying to kill each other getting market share. You don't want an industry where its suppliers have tremendous value. They're really tremendous power. They're extremely concentrated and they can dictate their prices. You'd rather have suppliers that are very competitive and they're competing on price. It's great to be an industry whose suppliers have a lot of rivalry within the industry versus being an industry where there's a lot of rivalry. You like to have barriers to entry, whether it's regulation or economies of scale, a lot of property, plant, and equipment, those kind of things. That protects the industry. You want to avoid an industry where there's a lot of substitution threats. So I worked at USAA, and USAA sold auto insurance and also made auto loans. Well, if autonomous vehicles come along and people stop buying cars and instead just use rideshare because rideshare is as cheap as owning a car, then that's a substitution threat that could shrink USAA 40, 50, 60%. Now, I also like the concept of economic moats. If we have time at the end of the semester, I'll show you my presentation on economic moats. Porter's 5 forces has been around a long time. Economic moats is a more recent idea, and it's probably a good one to work into your interviews because it's a much more topical idea. Warren Buffett loves the idea of economic moats. There's a lot of overlap between economic moats and Porter's 5 forces, but it's talking about how does a firm get a sustainable competitive advantage. And then also the concept of disruptive innovation. There's a guy by the name of Christensen. I think I've shown you his books before, talking about disruptive innovation. I would definitely read his books. That's where you're figuring out an industry that's doing fine right now, but there's some new innovation that's going to completely put them out of business. So you think about Blockbuster, if y'all even know who Blockbuster is, but Blockbuster was a video rental service. People go to their stores and rent DVDs, and they were doing fine. They're doing great. And when they were doing great, Netflix was already working well, and Blockbuster was somewhat ignoring Netflix, not thinking about Netflix going digital and being all online. I'm sure Blockbuster's management talked about it, but from Blockbuster's peak to when they finally went under was a very short period of time. So they had almost no time to respond. And Netflix was in that business as well. They used to mail out DVDs. And then they started doing things online, and what Netflix figured out is, hey, if we do stuff online, we're going to cannibalize our own business. We'll have fewer people that we're mailing DVDs to. But this is the future. This is the disruptive innovation. As we get the faster and faster internet speeds and downloading movies doesn't take so long, people are going to do that instead of going to Blockbuster. And sure enough, in a very short period of time, an entire industry was disrupted and a new player came along. And now you're seeing Netflix getting disrupted by these specialized carriers like Disney, and Apple TV and YouTube TV. You know, it's a cutthroat environment, but economic moats helps you understand who are those firms that are in trouble, or those industries that are in trouble or being disrupted. That's going to affect your growth rate, and that's another reason why I say fast growth rates, more than 10 years, are just so almost impossible in these days because there's so many people fighting to be the next Microsoft or the next Alphabet. So once you look at the industry, is the industry growing? Then look at the company and what sustainable competitive advantages they have. Again, the economic moats works down here. Porter has what he calls his Porter competitive strategies, cost leadership, differentiation, and focus. Those are really good concepts to learn. So Porter is really strong in that area. So if a company's growing faster than its industry, that means it's picking up market share. You need to ask what entities are giving up market share. So if a firm's picking, so obviously Amazon's picking up market share from Walmart, and Walmart's picking up market share from JCPenney and probably Home Depot and Lowe's and others. You know, you have to ask who's giving up market share and what are they going to do in response? Are they going to be aggressive and try to get that business back? Are they just going to throw in the towel and give up that part of their business? Remember earlier we talked about true growth being improvements in asset turnover and improvement in margins. So you have to think about that. How's the firm getting more traffic to their business? Facebook is a great example of this. If you look at Facebook's revenue per of its active users, that's been a really strong number, and it's getting stronger. At some point, Facebook may go too far, and their advertising might start turning people off, and they start actually leaving the platform. But right now, they're showing great asset turnover. They're getting more revenue per amount of effort that they're putting in, and then they're getting great margins. They have high margins, mainly because it really doesn't cost them that much to maintain their platform. They put some money into it. They obviously are right now working on some of the complaints some of the governments have around the world about privacy and those type of things. But it's a great business, but how long is that sustainable, and could someone come in and disrupt Facebook? And I know there's a lot of competitors that you guys use that I don't use because I'm an old guy, but what's coming in and take over? What is that disruptive innovation? So pay attention to those kind of things. If you notice a new platform that you're using, that you used to use Facebook and now you're using this new platform, what is it? What is it about that platform do you like? Could it go global and have 1 billion users and take over some of Facebook's business? And then the stock market itself will tell you about growth rates. So a PEG ratio, we're going to talk about PE ratios here in a little bit. A PEG ratio is a PE ratio divided by the expected growth. And so if you have the PE ratio and you have the PEG ratio, you can take the PE ratio and divide it by the PEG ratio, and that will give you expected growth in the near term. So we were looking at Walmart. Let's look at Google. Here's Alphabet. So if we click on the statistics for Alphabet, you can see that their PEG ratio is 1.67. Their PEG ratio equals 1.67, and their forward PE ratio, so we'll get their forward PE ratio. It's the PE ratio they expect next year is 27.25. So 167 and 27.75. So that right there is telling you what stock analysts believe Google's growth is going to be the next 5 years. So you take 27.25 and divide it by 1.67, and you get a growth rate of 16%. Pretty close to my 20% that I was using in my model, 16%. So over the next 5 years, remember my 20%, I was assuming 20%, but it would decline slowly over time. This 16% is the growth rate expected over the next 5 years on average. So that's the 5-year expected. So it's the forward PE divided by what the average analyst thinks their growth will be over the next 5 years. 16%, probably not that far off from the assumption I was using in mind. You can see what their PEG ratios have been historically. This is a new thing that Yahoo Finance has added, so you can see these things historically and what's going on with the firm. So that's a quick way to get an assumption, but it's not your assumption, it's the assumption of the average analyst. And so in that case, so 16.32, so in that case, that 16.32 is just what the average person thinks. So if you've got a better forecast than they have, you'll have a better valuation for Google than they would have. So I'll leave that in there. And it must be logical. Dr. Damodaran, he was talking about a student who was doing a growth forecast for Netflix. And Dr. Damodaran took his assumptions and extrapolated them out. And he said, wow, with your numbers, there will be like 8 billion people with a Netflix account. How in the world do you get that? But he was like, no, look at the growth they've had, look where they're going. And Dr. Damodaran had to point out that you have to get every single human being on the planet to have a Netflix account, plus their pets, and most people don't have, a husband and wife and kids aren't going to have multiple Netflix accounts. It's unlikely 100% of the world's going to have Netflix, and even then, his assumption was too great. And that's something you can certainly do. Do that with Facebook. One of the things we do with Facebook and forecasting them is go country by country and say, okay, Facebook has 40% of the U.S. market. Right now, they only have 5% of the India market. What happens? What kind of growth could Facebook get if they could get up to 25, 30% of India? What if they could get 30, 40% of China? Maybe they're not in China now because of restrictions or whatever. You do country by country, and you actually get those numbers. They're out there online, where Facebook is, every country, what percentage of the market they have. But what you got to make sure you come up with is not having Facebook having 120% of every person on the planet. That just doesn't make sense. But there are people who forecast these high growth rates, and if you really extrapolate them out, you discover that, yeah, it's just not logical. There's no practical way they can grow that fast. And that's when you know a stock is overpriced, if that's the kind of valuation that's required. All right, one last model I want to show you. So far, we have the dividend discount model. There we're taking dividend 0 times 1 plus long-term growth divided by KE minus long-term growth. The second model I showed you was the H model. It looks just like the dividend discount model, except we add dividend 0 times H times short-term growth minus long-term growth. So it's really not a completely different model. It's just an extension of the existing model. And so here we have the last model. It's called I call it the capitalized earnings model, or the CAP model. Not to be confused with CAPM. This is my own creation. It's not particularly spectacular or anything. In fact, Dr. Damodaran talks about this model, not because it's my model, because somebody else has something very similar. He doesn't like it. I disagree with him for the reason he doesn't like it. He's a famous professor from New York Stern School of Business and certainly highly respected, but I think his dislike of this model is a little bit overblown. But here what I do is, instead of using dividends, I use earnings per share 0 times, instead of long-term growth, I do 1 plus inflation. I use inflation. I'll explain why I use inflation. I divide that by KE minus inflation. So you'll notice this model also looks very much like the dividend discount model, except for here we use earnings instead of dividends, and we use inflation instead of long-term growth. So those are the three models. I just can't remember if I asked you to do the CAP earnings model for the Excel application 11. If I did, it's very easy to get. You just plug the numbers in. So what I'm assuming here is, let's assume a firm pays out 100% of their earnings every year. Now, if you remember the sustainable growth model, it says your growth is return on earnings minus, return on equity times 1 minus payout. Well, if payout's 100%, then that implies you have 0 growth. Well, I say you have 0 growth, except you should be able to grow your business just with inflation. So if Walmart paid out all of their earnings as dividends, they wouldn't be able to build new stores because they wouldn't have any money to do it. They would have sent out every single dollar that they made. But they could raise their prices with inflation. If they raise their prices with inflation, even though their costs may go up with inflation, their earnings will still go up with inflation. They have a little bit of money that they can reinvest in the firm to fix things. So they have depreciation, which is a non-cash. So I think it's reasonable to expect a firm pays out all or most of their earnings. They should be able to grow at least with inflation. And so that's the formula I use. EPS 0 times 1 plus inflation. That gives you EPS 1. It's the same as my formula. I'm just using EPS 1 instead of that formula. If you use this model outside of my class, you have to explain it. That this model assumes the firm pays out 100% of its earnings, and that growth will be limited only to inflation because they cannot build any new capacity in the business. All right, so what we want to do now, we have a couple of things left here before we get into the last part of the class, and I don't know if we get into the last part of this class. I'll probably show the economic moats before I do some of that last part. So what we need to do is apply what we've just done here for stocks, and I'm going to use the Excel application 11 to do it, and then I'll do the first problem there, and you'll do the other problems there. And then what I'll do is we'll talk about relative value analysis, and then if we have time at the end, we'll do economic moats. So I'm going to put this on pause just for a second to bring up the problem. All right, so here's Excel application 11. We're going to start with Allstate. So we have Allstate, then we have Costco, and that's it. I just gave you two, so this should be pretty straightforward. So Allstate, their ticker is ALL. They sell personal property and casualty insurance, life insurance, retirement, investment products. So you're going to use the constant growth dividend discount model. You're also going to do an Excel table. You're going to use the H model and the cap. So there it is. I do have the cap earnings model in there. So I'm going to copy this into Excel. So there's our problem, so it's not very easy to read. All right, so let's put these up. I'll start on line 19 or line 20. So let's just put each one of these in. So we got the 10-year Treasury. Remember, we use the 10-year Treasury as our discount rate, as our risk-free rate. And that's 2.5%. So we'll just plug that in. And then inflation, our inflation assumption is 2%. We'll need that for the cap earnings model. Our beta is 1.1. Make sure it's not a percent, 1.1. But our range, we're going to go from 0.9. Actually, we're going to go from 1.25 to 0.9. We'll start with the largest and go down to the smallest number. We're going to use that when we do the data table. So our worst case and our best case. The equity risk premium, our market risk premium, that is 0.055% or 5.5%. Their dividends, and this is dividend 0. The way you can tell this is dividend 0, it says dividends for the last 12 months. So that's $2. Their earnings per share 0 is 7.32. Their long-term growth is given. I say assume the U.S. economy is going to grow 5.5%. And that's what we think Allstate will grow. And then our range on that is we think it might be as low as 4.5%. And it could be as high as 6%. So here we're going to go by 0.5s And here we're going to go by 0.25s. And then our short-term growth is given in the last paragraph. All states management expects growth to be 10% next year. So there's your short-term growth. And then our H, that half-life, how long does it take to go from 10% to 5.5%? You can see they're going to move back to long-term growth rate comparable to economic growth over a 10-year period. So that makes our H is 5. Remember, your H is 1/2 of that period of time it takes to get from your short-term growth rate to your long-term growth rate. So we have everything together that we need. And so what we'll do is we're going to do the dividend. Well, we got to get the KE. Let's see if we can get the KE in there. Remember, it's the risk-free rate plus beta. Hopefully you have this memorized for permanently, times the equity risk premium, our market risk premium. So let's at least get our discount rate in there. So the risk-free rate is 2.5% plus beta times the market risk premium. So our discount rate for Allstate is 8.55%. All right, and that's really the only formula we have in here. So what we'll do next class, we'll do the dividend discount model, the H model, and the Kappa earnings model. And we'll do a data table. All right, so next class we'll get through all of these, and we should be able to do these fairly quickly, and the data model will probably take me some time, so we'll see. All right, thanks.